They acted like my wedding was optional. But how would you feel if your dad said, "We can't be there. Your sister's big launch matters more"? I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I married overlooking the Mediterranean while they posed for press outside her store. Then the internet did what they never expected. It compared our worlds side by side and asked why a daughter had to celebrate alone. One photo from my 7-number villa in Amalfi told the truth better than any confrontation ever could. I'm Madison Clark, and this is the day their choices finally caught up with them. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The late afternoon sun slanted through the west windows of my office, catching the edge of a brass scale model and painting my desk in a soft, molten orange. Clark's studio was quiet at this hour. Just the hum of the air system and the faint echo of footsteps from someone locking up down the hall. I sat back in my chair, rolling my shoulders after a long video call with our partners in Rome, and skimmed my wedding checklist on the tablet in front of me. Flowers finalized, guest list intentionally short, travel dates almost set. For the first time in months, everything felt like it was finally falling into place. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Dad. I froze for a beat the way I always did when his name lit up my phone. Old habits, I guess. Even at 35, some reflexes never die. I inhaled slowly, tasting the faint scent of coffee that had long gone cold, then swiped to answer. "Hi, Dad," I said, keeping my voice even. His came back, sharp, clipped, all business. Madison. "I'll get straight to it. We can't come to your wedding." I didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the reflection of the sun melting across the conference table. "Okay," I said quietly. "Why your sister's opening her new flagship store this weekend? It's a major launch. She needs us more than you do." For a moment, everything in the room seemed to still. The air, the light, even my own breath. I could almost hear the ocean outside our building, or maybe that was just blood rushing in my ears. I swallowed and lifted my gaze to the window, watching the horizon glow brighter, like the sun was answering for me. "I see," I said. "Well, good. Now I know where I stand." There was an awkward inhale on the other end of the line, the kind he used to take when he wasn't sure whether to scold or dismiss me. But today he chose neither. He said nothing at all. The silence stretched so long, I could almost feel it press against my chest. "I hope the event goes well," I added, not because I meant it, but because it felt like the only clean way to end the call. He didn't reply. I lowered the phone and ended the call myself. The quiet in the office suddenly felt bigger, almost cavernous. I let the phone rest on my lap and leaned back, letting my head fall against the chair. For years, moments like this had gutted me. Every time I was passed over, ignored, or quietly replaced by Victoria, the daughter who fit the Clark mold. But now, as the echo of his words faded, something surprising washed over me. Peace, not anger, not hurt, just a strange, almost defiant calm. I stood and walked to the wall where I kept the heart of my studio pinned. Concept boards, sketches, textures, lighting studies. At the center was a rendering of Amalfi Villa, the project I'd spent the last 2 years refining. My colors, my lines, my vision. The life I'd built without anyone's permission. I traced the edge of the printed coastline with my fingertip. If they couldn't show up for me, then they simply wouldn't be part of the moment I married the one person who always did. I crossed the room to my desk, opened my laptop, and drafted a short email to Ryan. Amalfi. Just the two of us. M. Before hitting send, I hesitated, picturing his face when he read it, how he'd smile in that soft, certain way of his, like he understood my choice before I even explained it. Ryan never tried to fix my wounds. He just stood beside me while I learned how to stop bleeding. I pressed send. The sun dipped lower, flooding the office in that warm, dreamy gold photographers spent their lives chasing. It brushed over my shelves, my framed degrees, and the stack of design journals I kept meaning to read. And then it caught a particular folder on the corner of my desk, navy blue, worn at the edges with a silver embossed label my mentor had gifted me when I opened the studio. Build what they can't ignore. The words shimmered faintly in the light, almost like they were written just for this moment. I picked up the folder, letting its weight settle in my hand. I thought about the years it had taken to get here. The nights working through deadlines, the months living out of suitcases before our Rome office stabilized the sacrifices I made, without ever asking if anyone noticed. I thought about my father's voice just now, empty and unwavering, choosing my sister without hesitation. And I thought about the sea outside my soon-to-be wedding venue, calm and ancient, untouched by any of it. I walked to the window, watching a yacht drift along the Newport coastline, its hull glinting like a shard of diamond in the fading sun. People on board laughed loud enough that even from the 15th floor I could see their joy. Good for them, I thought. People should show up for the things that matter. My reflection in the glass stared back at me, tired, a little worn, but steadier than I'd been at 20 or even 30. Stronger now. A version of myself I fought for. I closed the blinds halfway, letting the room soften. On instinct, I reached for my phone again. There were no messages from my mother. Not surprising. If Dad delivered the family decisions, Mom packaged them into something polite enough to pass. Maybe she'd send a text later. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, I didn't feel the familiar sting I used to. I slipped the phone into my bag, grabbed my keys, and walked toward the door. The office lights turned off automatically behind me, leaving the space washed in twilight. As I stepped into the hallway, I whispered to myself, not as a promise, but as a quiet acknowledgement. That chapter is closed. I locked the door, exhaled, and headed for the elevator, ready to begin the next one. The elevator doors slid shut behind me, and the cool evening air wrapped around me as I stepped outside. I headed toward my car keys loose in my hand, but instead of driving home right away, I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the quiet settle. My mind drifted. Not to the wedding, not to Ryan, not even to Italy, but backward to a dining room in Newport Beach 15 years ago. It was strange how memory could hit like a scent, or a shift of light, or a sentence spoken in the wrong tone. Tonight, it was the way my father's voice had flattened, the way it always did when he'd already made up his mind. I could still see that night too clearly. The Clark dining room in 2009 was enormous for no reason. High ceilings, white columns, a chandelier that looked like it belonged in a hotel ballroom. I was 20, home from Berkeley for the weekend, still wearing paint on my forearm from a late-night studio rush. Victoria sat across from me, perfect as always at 22, scrolling through her phone until Dad called her name. "Show us the new campaign photos," he said. His voice held pride, the kind coated in sugar and expectation. She spun her phone around and both of them leaned in like she was unveiling a national treasure. Mom gasped, "You look stunning, sweetheart." Dad shook his head admiringly. "Your mother's right. If the brand has any sense at all, they'll put you on TV next quarter." Victoria smiled, basking in it. I cut in before I could stop myself. I won an award this week for my structural design project. My professor said it might get submitted to a national competition. Dad didn't even look up from the phone. "That's good, Maddie. But your sister just got invited to appear on a televised panel. That's exposure you can't buy." My chest tightened in the way it used to back then. Too familiar, too practiced. I forced a smile, told myself not to look disappointed, and picked at the edge of my napkin. Victoria didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She was used to being the center of their universe. Value in my family was measured by what the world could see. After dinner, I remember slipping outside onto the back patio, the one overlooking the manicured yard Dad was so proud of. The cicadas buzzed, the pool lights flickered on, and for a minute, Newport Beach felt like a gilded cage. I was young, trying to swallow the sting, trying to convince myself I didn't care. But I did. The next memory came right after an even older one. I was 15, sitting at the kitchen table with a sketchbook full of half-formed building ideas. I'd shown Dad a drawing of a coastal home. Slanted roofs, open windows for natural airflow, something I'd dreamed up after a road trip with a friend. He barely glanced at it. "Why are you wasting so much time on this? It's just doodling. It's not going to get you anywhere." I remember the feeling like a slap, even though he never raised a hand. Just his voice was enough. I closed the sketchbook and pretended not to care, but something inside me folded that day, creasing in ways I didn't know how to smooth out until years later. Sitting in my car now, I felt the ghost of that moment, the ache, the humiliation, but it didn't hurt the same way anymore. It had softened with time, like a bruise that finally stopped blooming. My phone vibrated in the cup holder, snapping me back. I picked it up, expecting maybe a message from Ryan, but the caller ID said Eleanor. I answered instantly. "Hi, Aunt Elle." Her voice was warm, like always, like summer evenings and olive trees, and 100 soft things I never found at home. I didn't wake you, did I? No. Just leaving the office. There was a pause. A perceptive one. Your voice sounds tight. What happened? I almost laughed. She always heard the things I didn't say out loud. Dad called. Ah, another pause. And they're not coming. Victoria's store opening is the same weekend. Apparently she needs them more. A quiet exhale came through the line. Not surprised, not dramatic, just sat in the gentle way people get when an old wound reopens. Are you still drawing? She asked. The question hit deeper than I expected. She'd asked me the same thing when I left for Berkeley, when I won my first internship, when I called her crying at 26 because a senior architect stole my design credit. Yes, I said. Of course. Good. Then don't let them shrink you. People who can't see you clearly will always misjudge your worth. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. The tension in my shoulders eased a little. It always did when she called. We talked for a few more minutes. Nothing big, just her checking on me, me assuring her I was fine, both of us knowing she could hear the parts of me that weren't. When we hung up, the parking lot looked dimmer. The sun, now a thin orange line disappearing behind the buildings. I walked back into the office for a moment, unsure why. Maybe I needed to breathe one more time in the space I'd built myself. The framed photos along the hallway, projects I'd completed, teams I'd led, seemed to glow under the track lighting. Then I saw it, a family photo hanging beside a bookshelf taken when I was 17, Dad. Mom, Victoria, all smiling. I stood on the far right, half hidden behind Mom's shoulder because Victoria had insisted on moving to the center. The cropping made it look like someone had forgotten I was there at all. I stared at that version of myself, the girl trying to be small enough not to make waves, and felt something sharp twist inside me, then release. Silence can be the beginning of freedom. I touched the edge of the frame lightly, almost in farewell, then turned off the lights and walked out again. The night air felt cleaner this time, like something inside me had finally shifted into place. I didn't look back as I headed to my car. There was no need to. When my plane touched down in Rome in the spring of 2017, I remember staring out the window as the city unfolded beneath me. Warm-toned rooftops, tangled streets, and a sky so blue it looked almost unreal. I'd been to Italy once as a tourist, but arriving this time felt different. I wasn't here for a vacation. I was here to rebuild something in myself I wasn't sure I even had the courage to touch. The cab ride from Fiumicino to Trastevere took nearly an hour, weaving through traffic that moved like a living organism. Vespas darted between cars, horns sounded more like conversation than irritation. And everywhere I looked, people seemed unrushed in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we crossed the Tiber River, sunlight bounced off the water and onto the weathered facades of the buildings along the banks. Rome looked old, chaotic, imperfect, and somehow I felt like I was exhaling for the first time. Eleanor lived on a quiet street off a cobblestone alley in a building that leaned just enough to make me glance twice. I dragged my suitcase up the narrow stairs, the wheels clacking against stone, and knocked on her door. It swung open almost immediately. Finally, she said, smiling, in that understated way of hers. A smile you could miss if you weren't paying attention. You actually came. I stepped inside and for a moment I just stood there stunned. The apartment was small, 2 rooms and a balcony, but it overflowed with light. The walls were chipped in places, the tile floor cracked, and every surface was covered with rolled-up blueprints, paint-splattered mugs, and stacks of architectural books in 3 different languages. It's beautiful, I said. It's honest, she corrected. Beautiful comes later. She hugged me then, and I felt something inside me soften. Maybe it was the warmth of her arms, maybe it was the fact that she didn't ask how I'd been or why I'd left so suddenly. She already knew. Within an hour, she had set me up at a large wooden table near the balcony, pushing aside a tower of old design journals. This is your spot, she said. Light's good in the mornings, terrible in the afternoons, but that keeps you humble. I laughed, the sound surprising even me. We worked side by side for days without much small talk. Eleanor had a way of teaching without announcing it. She'd point to a line on my sketch, raise a brow, and I'd know exactly what she meant. One morning, as we flipped through drafts of historical villas, she tapped the corner of a page. Don't build to be admired, she said. Build to be remembered. There's a difference. Her words rooted themselves in me. I didn't tell her how deeply they hit, but she must have seen something shift in my face because she gave a small nod like she knew. Later that week, while the smell of fresh espresso drifted through the window, I began sketching something I hadn't dared to put on paper back in California. A home on the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast. Clean angles, white stone, natural light pouring through open spaces, wood accents softened by salt air. A place designed not for show, but for quiet. I didn't have a plan for it. I certainly didn't imagine building it. It was just what I wanted the inside of my chest to feel like. Stillness, warmth, a horizon no one could take away from me. Eleanor walked by, glanced at the sketch, and didn't say a word. She simply placed a new charcoal pencil beside me and kept walking. Approval without praise. Her specialty. A few days later, she invited someone to join us. I heard the knock from the balcony where I was reworking a roofline. Eleanor opened the door, greeted him in effortless Italian, and then gestured me over. "This is Ryan," she said. "Structural engineer. American." Unfortunately, he laughed, unbothered. "I promise I only bring the good parts of home." He looked to be around my age, maybe a couple of years older. Dark blonde hair, sleeves rolled up, a mechanical pencil tucked behind his ear. He shook my hand firm and warm. "I've heard a lot about you," he said. "All lies." "I'm sure," I replied. We spent the afternoon talking through load-bearing options for some of Eleanor's older projects, and by evening he'd pulled a chair next to mine at the drafting table. He studied my Amalfi sketch for a long moment before speaking. "You design like someone who's trying to build a feeling," he said. I didn't know how to respond because no one had ever understood it that quickly. Over the following weeks, he became part of our routine. Mornings were for strong coffee, and even stronger critiques, afternoons for walks along the Tiber or gelato runs, when Eleanor insisted we balance the bitterness with something sweet. Somewhere in those weeks, admiration turned into something softer. Something that made my pulse quicken when he leaned over my sketches, or brushed past me to reach a blueprint. I didn't analyze it. I just let it be. But even in Rome, the past had a habit of calling. One evening after Ryan left and the studio had fallen into a golden hush, my phone lit up with a call from home. "Mom!" I debated letting it ring out, but old habits tugged again. I answered. "Maddie, honey." "How are you?" she asked, voice light too light. "I'm good, Mom. Busy. And when are you coming back?" "Your father says it's time to think seriously about your future. You can't stay there forever. Do you even have anyone helping you?" Her words were gentle weapons, soft enough to pass for concern, sharp enough to draw blood. I looked around the studio. Eleanor reading under a lamp, the city glowing outside, my sketches spread across the table. Ryan's handwriting still scribbled in the margins. "Yes," I said. "I did some—" She hesitated. "Who, me?" I replied. "And people who actually see me." There was a pause on the line long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Then she cleared her throat. "Well," she said carefully, "just don't forget where home is." I ended the call before I could respond. Home is where you stop pretending you're small. I set the phone down, picked up my pencil, and returned to the sketch of the villa on the cliff. The lines felt steadier this time, more certain, like the drawing finally understood what it wanted to become. Outside, Rome buzzed with life. Messy, loud, unfiltered, and for the first time in years, I felt like I fit somewhere. Or at least I wasn't trying so hard not to disappear. I worked until the streetlights flickered on, and the shadows lengthened across the balcony floor. When I finally stood to stretch, Eleanor looked up at me over her glasses. "You're changing," she said simply. "I know." "Good. Real architects don't stay unchanged." A breeze slipped through the open window, carrying the smell of espresso and warm brick. I leaned against the railing, letting the city swirl beneath me. I had no idea what the next years would bring. I just knew I wasn't afraid of them anymore. The morning of the launch felt unreal, the kind of soft, shimmering morning light that made Rome look like it had been painted just hours before. Clark's Studio Europe wasn't large, 3 rooms and an open terrace, but it was mine. Every beam, every fixture, every sketch pinned on the walls carried a piece of the years I'd spent finding my voice. The courtyard below buzzed with early foot traffic, espresso machines hissing from the cafe next door, and the low hum of Italian chatter floating upward through open windows. Inside, we'd set everything with quiet intention. Raw wood tables, white linen candles in recycled glass jars, bowls of lemons. From the Amalfi Market, I wanted the space to feel like air. Open, warm, unpretentious. a place where ideas could breathe. Guests trickled in slowly, mostly colleagues, a few friends from the design world, local partners, and even a handful of neighbors Eleanor had charmed into coming. She stood near the entrance in a linen blazer, silver hair tucked behind one ear, holding a glass of Prosecco, with the same ease she held a drafting pencil. Ryan was at the front, already deep into conversation with a small group. He gestured animatedly at one of the structural models, a modular building system we'd been refining for months, his voice warm, steady, thoughtful. I watched him talk. Watched the way people leaned in when he explained something. He had a way of making everything sound possible. When I stepped forward to start the presentation, everyone turned. My palms felt warm, but not from nerves, more like an acknowledgement of the moment. Eleanor gave me a small nod, telling me without words that I was ready. "Thank you for being here," I began. Clark Studio was built with one idea at its center. Architecture isn't just shapes or lines or calculations. It is the feeling people carry with them long after they leave a space. I paused, letting the room settle. When someone steps into a home and feels safe, or walks through a lobby and feels inspired, or enters a public square and feels like they belong, that is architecture. Buildings don't speak, but they can change us. I looked at my sketches on the wall, the early versions of the Amalfi Villa, the resort concepts, the urban housing studies. We design not for applause, I said, but for resonance. There was a quiet murmur of approval, the kind that doesn't fill a room, but roots itself in it. When I stepped back, Eleanor squeezed my arm gently. "Well," said she whispered. By noon, the studio was full. Journalists took photos, business cards were exchanged, and the scent of lemon pastries from the cafe drifted inside every time the breeze pushed the doors open. During a brief lull, I checked my phone out of habit. A notification popped onto my screen. An alert from a business magazine in the U.S. Vogue Business released a new cover, Victoria Clark, in a sharp ivory suit sitting on a marble pedestal. The headline, "The Face of the Clark Legacy." My breath didn't hitch. It barely even moved. I opened the article, scrolling past polished photographs of my sister, her poised smile, the dramatic lighting, the perfectly styled hair. She talked about being the visionary voice of the Clark family, about inheriting the creative instinct from our lineage, about building a brand that reflected everything the Clarks stand for. Not once did my name appear. I closed the tab without finishing the article. They were telling a story I wasn't in, and I let them keep it. As I set my phone down, Ryan walked over, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah, just reading something familiar." He studied my face. "They'll keep telling the version that suits them, you know." "I know." "Are you really going to let them forget you exist?" I looked around the studio, at the people admiring the work, at the models Ryan built by hand at Eleanor, explaining a facade study to a couple visiting from Florence. "I don't need them to remember me," I said. "One day, I'll tell my story in a way they can't ignore. And it won't matter who's listening." Ryan lifted his glass, soft smile forming. "To that day." We clinked gently. After the event ended, the 3 of us, Eleanor, Ryan, and I, sat on the terrace as the sun dipped low, painting the terracotta rooftops in a molten orange. I was exhausted, but full, like my chest had been scraped clean and refilled with something weightless. We were halfway through a shared plate of olives when Eleanor's phone buzzed. She scanned the email and raised an eyebrow. "You might want to read this," she said, handing me the screen. It was a formal invitation from the office of the mayor of Positano. A proposal for Clark Studio to submit concepts for a new eco-resort project on the Amalfi Coast. Something sustainable, modern, rooted in the region's natural beauty. They'd reviewed my portfolio. They wanted me specifically. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, smiling more openly than I'd seen her smile in years. "I hope you're ready," she said. "Your life is about to change." Ryan nudged my shoulder lightly. "Looks like someone in Italy knows exactly who you are." My throat tightened, not with sadness this time, but with a kind of stunned gratitude. "Amalfi." I whispered, "Of all places, the place I had dreamed of quietly, secretly, the place I'd been sketching long before I believed it could be real, the place that felt like the inside of my chest." Eleanor lifted her glass. "To beginnings we build for ourselves." We toasted as the church bells rang in the distance. Rome glowed beneath us, alive and old and full of promise. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the path ahead without fear, just clarity. The villa was still half a skeleton when I realized how much of myself I'd built into it. Bare beams framed the sky, sunlight spilled through unfinished archways, and the scent of sawdust mixed with the clean bite of sea air drifting up from the cliffs. It was early fall of 2023, the kind of evening when the Amalfi coastline seemed to glow from within, as if the sun was taking its time saying goodbye. I'd spent the entire day reviewing progress with the project team, moving from room to room, checking lines, materials, site paths, ventilation routes. The villa was becoming real. Angles I had once only sketched in Rome now stood in 3 dimensions around me. Every new shadow, every curve of stone felt like the confirmation of something I'd been waiting years to hear. You were right to come here. After the team packed up for the day, I stayed behind on the top floor, brushing dust from my palms, watching the horizon melt from gold to amber. The cliffs were quiet, broken only by the distant sound of a boat engine and the soft rustling of olive trees below. I didn't hear Ryan walk up behind me until his hand slipped gently into mine. "Come with me," he said. His voice carried that warm certainty he always seemed to have when he'd made up his mind about something. He led me toward the balcony, just a platform, now 2 columns, no railing yet, opening directly to the drop of the cliffs and the wide breathing sea. I stepped onto the plywood floor, letting the wind whip my hair around my face. Ryan turned to me, eyes bright in the fading light. "I've wanted to do this here," he said, "before the villa is finished, before it becomes the backdrop for everything else." He pulled a small box from his pocket. My breath caught. "I'm not going to promise I'll be beside you forever, because neither of us knows what forever looks like," he said, voice steady, honest. "But I will promise this. I won't be the person who keeps you from flying. I'll be the one who watches you take off and says, 'Go.'" Something in me cracked open, soft and aching. Ryan opened the box, and the ring caught the last flare of sunset, simple, elegant. Nothing flashy, just right. "Madison," he said, "will you marry me?" I didn't cry right away. I just stared at him, feeling the wind on my skin, the smell of the sea, the weight of what he was offering. A partnership without conditions, a life without being trimmed down to fit someone else's comfort. Then the tears came, quiet, warm, almost gentle. "Yes," I breathed. "Of course, yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and I laughed through the tears, leaning into his chest as he wrapped his arms around me. For a moment, the world shrank to the 2 of us, held afloat by salt air and a half-finished balcony. Later that evening, we gathered a handful of friends and colleagues, people who had become a kind of chosen family, on the rooftop terrace. Eleanor had insisted on setting out a modest spread, fresh bread olives, lemon pasta, 3 bottles of Prosecco she'd been saving for something that actually matters. She raised her glass when everyone settled. To Madison, she said, her voice clear despite the wind, "You've built a dream that needed no one's approval but your own. And now look at it. You're living inside it." I felt myself flush, caught between pride and humility. People clapped, laughed, cheered. Ryan kissed the side of my head. I looked over the terrace railing at the half-lit coastline, the water turning darker by the minute. Everything felt suspended in golden light. Hope, gratitude, the feeling of belonging. After the dinner plates were cleared and the last of our guests trickled out, I walked downstairs to the lower landing where the air was cooler. I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen before tapping my father's number. The call rang twice. He answered on the 3rd ring. "What is it, Madison?" he asked, sounding distracted. I could hear voices in the background, probably a dinner party, something formal by the sound of clinking glasses. "I wanted to tell you something," I said. "I'm getting married." There was a brief silence, then a non-committal, "Who's walking you down the aisle?" he asked. "Eleanor." I answered. I heard him exhale sharply. That woman again. Why does she insist on being involved? She's always... I didn't let him finish. I lifted the phone from my ear and stared at it for a moment, feeling the numbness spread through me like cold water. Then I hung up. No explanation. No justification. Nothing more. Sometimes not answering is the only way to protect the parts of yourself that finally learned how to breathe. I stood there until the call log faded from the screen, then tucked the phone away, and stepped out toward the balcony again. The sky had deepened to indigo scattered with the first stars. The sea looked like a sheet of dark silk stretching endlessly. Ryan walked up behind me, sliding his arms around my waist. "You okay?" he asked. I rested my hands on his. "Yeah, they'll never understand, but you do." He pressed his cheek lightly against my temple. "That's enough." And for the first time in my life, it really felt like it was. The waves kept rolling in below us, steady, patient, carrying the promise of everything we hadn't built yet. The week leading up to the wedding felt strangely split in two, as if my life had divided itself into parallel universes, one unfolding beneath the sun-washed cliffs of Amalfi, the other pulsing under neon lights in Los Angeles. I woke each morning to the sound of waves brushing against the rocks below the villa, but my phone buzzed non-stop with updates from back home. News alerts, press headlines, tagged posts. All of them about Victoria, VC studio, the launch, the guest list, the red carpet, the sponsors, the interviews. Even from Italy, I could feel the heat building around her big moment. One afternoon, as the sky drifted toward a softer shade of blue, Ryan and I walked into a small flower shop tucked between a bakery and a ceramics studio. Buckets of peonies and olive branches spilled over the doorway. The older woman who owned the place recognized Ryan immediately and rushed over to hug him. They exchanged greetings in rapid Italian, while I moved from display to display, brushing my fingers across petals, letting myself imagine how everything would look arranged on the terrace. "You always pick the elegant ones," the woman told me in accented English, appearing beside me with a basket of fresh-cut stems. "Simple. Honest. They suit you." I smiled. "We want something natural. Nothing overdone." "Ah," she said, nodding knowingly. "A wedding for the heart, not the camera." I wasn't sure if she meant to jab, but it landed anyway. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of citrus. Ryan and I walked down to the narrow path that curved along the cliffside toward the villa. He held the basket of flowers against his chest, glancing over at me. "You're quiet," he said. "Just thinking about them." "No," I said truthfully. "About us." He nudged my arm with his elbow. "Good. I like that version better." Back at the villa, Eleanor was waiting with the dress she'd been altering for weeks. A simple lace design, soft and timeless. She lifted it up toward the sunlight filtering in through the open balcony doors. "You'll glow in this," she said. "It's perfect," I told her. "No," she corrected gently. "It's yours." While she helped me into it, my phone buzzed on the table. I didn't check it right away. We were laughing at something, Eleanor telling me how the seamstress down the street insisted on adding rhinestones, and Eleanor practically fought her off. When the buzzing finally tugged at me, it was a text from my mother. "Your father feels awful, honey, but you understand right, Victoria needs us. This launch is important." I stared at the message as if it were a familiar bruise someone had pressed again without warning. Something inside me softened, but not in the way it used to, not like capitulation, not like longing. Just acceptance. I set the phone down. Eleanor must have noticed something shift in my expression because she paused with the lace in her hands. "You don't have to pretend you're fine with everything," she said. "I'm not pretending," I answered. "I'm choosing." She nodded, satisfied. Later that day, Ryan and I walked down to the rocky beach below the villa. The stones were warm under my feet, the sea calm enough to let the sunlight glide across its surface like brushed gold. Picked up a sprig of olive from the arrangement basket and twirled it between my fingers. "You okay?" he asked again gently. "I'm good," I said. "They're just living their version of life, and I'm finally living mine." He smiled. "That sounds like growth. It feels like oxygen." We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the tide. A small boat drifted past in the distance, its wake rolling toward us, slowly dissolving against the rocks. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Los Angeles was gearing up for the most significant night of my sister's career. I saw it through news updates. Bright red carpets rolled out in front of the store billboards, plastered with Victoria's face influencers, and celebrities arriving with cameras flashing. Richard stood beside her in a sharp navy suit, giving interviews with his hand proudly on her back. "Clark family stands for American vision and style," he said into a microphone. "Tonight is proof of that." The reporters ate it up. Victoria posed gracefully, raising her champagne glass under a rain of camera flashes. Back in Amalfi, the only flash I saw came from the sunlight hitting the water. As the evening settled in, I walked up from the beach slowly, the olive sprig still in my hand. The air was cool and salty, curling around me like an embrace. At the top of the path, I paused and looked out across the coastline. The pastel houses stacked like a dream, the sky fading from gold to lavender. A world away from theirs. A world that finally felt like mine. Inside the villa, Ryan arranged the flowers we'd chosen, and Eleanor poured herself a glass of white wine, humming quietly. I stepped outside again, my dress brushing against my legs, and made my way toward the open terrace. The wind lifted my hair just as I reached the edge of the cliff. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the last warmth of the sun. Silence isn't always the result of hurt. Sometimes it's the result of choosing yourself. When I opened my eyes, the scene before me felt almost unreal. The sea glowing faintly, the sky deepening the world, holding its breath in that perfect pause before nightfall. I stepped forward, the bouquet of olive sprigs in my hand, and walked across the stones toward the villa where Ryan and Eleanor waited. And somewhere across the ocean, under flashing lights and glittering cameras, my sister raised her glass. But here, under a quiet sky, I raised mine, too. Just not to them, and not for the same reasons. The sky was still a pale gray when I woke, the kind of soft early light that makes the whole coastline seem to inhale before the day begins. I lay there for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of waves hitting the cliffs below the villa. It sounded like a heartbeat. Calm, patient, anchored. For a wedding morning, it felt almost unreal how quiet everything was. I slipped out of bed and crossed the room barefoot. The tile floor was cool under my feet as I opened the balcony doors. Positano was just starting to wake. A few lights blinked in the stacked houses on the hillside, and the sun, still shy, cast a faint silver glow across the water. Fishing boats drifted back toward shore. A couple of gulls circled lazily above. It felt worlds away from everything I'd grown up with. Eleanor knocked softly before pushing the door open. "Good morning, darling," she said, already holding the small velvet box with the silver hairpin she'd promised to give me. I sat in front of the mirror while she stood behind me, her hands steady as she began twisting my hair into a loose, elegant knot. The silver hairpin caught the light as she fastened it in place. For a moment, I saw her reflection looking at me the way a parent should. Soft, proud, grounded. "You look like yourself," she said quietly. "That's all a bride ever needs." I swallowed the knot in my throat. "Thank you. For everything." "Oh, don't start with gratitude now," she muttered, pretending to wave it off. "You'll ruin my makeup before the ceremony." We both laughed. Down below, guests from all corners of my life filtered toward the terrace. I glimpsed colleagues from Rome, design partners from Florence, a few clients who had become friends. They wore bright linen summer dresses, navy suits, the kind of understated elegance you only ever see at European weddings. Ryan waited under the floral arch we'd built the night before. Olive branches and white wildflowers draped over the top, swaying in the soft breeze. He stood there with his hands clasped, talking to the officiant, sunlight catching the edge of his suit jacket. He looked calm, steady, like the version of home I'd chosen for myself. When Eleanor finished pinning the last strand of hair, she kissed my cheek. "Ready?" I took a breath and nodded. She looped her arm through mine just as the music began. A single violin playing something simple and old drifting out over the cliffside. As we stepped into the open air, the world seemed to brighten all at once. The sun lifted higher, spilling gold across the rooftops. The sea, the faces of everyone who turned to watch us. I lifted my eyes toward the horizon, letting the warmth settle into my skin. A week ago, my family chose glitter and noise. Today, I was choosing quiet. Ryan's face shifted the moment he saw me. Warmth, surprise, something tender flickering in his eyes. I think I smiled without realizing it. Walking toward him felt less like a ceremony and more like arriving somewhere I had been heading for years. When we reached the arch, Eleanor placed my hand into his and squeezed my fingers before stepping back. The officiant spoke briefly, but honestly, most of it blurred. What I remember clearly is the way Ryan's thumb brushed over my knuckles, the way the breeze tugged gently at my dress, the scent of lemon blossoms from the courtyard below. And then, suddenly, we were exchanging rings. Ryan slipped the band onto my finger, murmuring his vows in a voice only I could hear. No cages, no anchors, just wind when you need it. and a landing place when you don't. My chest tightened. I placed his ring on his hand and whispered, "With you, I don't have to shrink." We didn't cry. Neither of us needed to. The peace between us was too deep for tears. Eleanor stepped forward and held both our hands for a moment, smiling the soft, proud smile she rarely let the world see. "You two," she said, "will build something the world will remember." People applauded gently. There were no fireworks, no theatrics, just sunlight, sea air, and a chorus of quiet joy. After the ceremony, while everyone drifted toward the terrace for champagne and canapes, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Lydia Hartman stood there with her camera in hand, her hair pinned loosely back in the way journalists do when they want to pretend they're not trying too hard. "Congratulations," she said, snapping a candid shot before I could protest. "You glow almost as brightly as this view." I laughed. "Don't start crafting headlines." She raised a brow. "You know people back home have no idea who you are." "They should." "Please," I said. "Let me have one thing that's just mine." Lydia smirked. "I'm not promising anything. Some stories write themselves whether you want them to or not." She walked away before I could argue, the camera swinging against her shoulder. Later, after the food had been cleared and the last toast was made, I slipped into the study to catch my breath. My dress rustled softly as I sat on the windowsill, watching the shadows stretch across the village below. My phone buzzed once. A new email. From Lydia Hartman. Subject: feature pitch. Urgent. I opened it. American architect redefines. Family proposal submitted to Coastal Living magazine. A single line of description sat beneath it. "Not every legacy is inherited. Some are built." I stared at the screen, feeling something shift inside me again. Not pain, not pride, but a quiet understanding. The world was starting to see me, whether my family ever did or not. I closed the laptop gently, letting the room fall back into silence as the sound of laughter drifted in from the terrace. The morning sun filtered through the olive branches above us, scattering soft, uneven patches of light across the small wooden table where Ryan and I sat, finishing breakfast. The villa still smelled faintly of the lemon cake our neighbor brought the night before, and the air held that early Amalfi coolness that disappears by noon. It had been a week since the wedding, yet I still felt wrapped in that strange bubble of calm, as if the world had slowed just enough to let me breathe. Ryan poured more coffee into my cup. "You look rested," he said. "I feel rested," I answered, leaning back in my chair, stretching my toes against the tiled floor, like I finally put something heavy down. He smiled, but then his gaze flicked toward my phone lying face up on the table. It had been vibrating nonstop. Short bursts, then longer ones, then 3 in a row. I'd ignored them, assuming they were late wedding congratulations, studio emails, or updates from suppliers. Then it buzzed again. And again. Ryan reached for it before I did. "Hold on," he murmured, brow furrowing as he unlocked the screen. "You might want to see this." He handed it to me. My notifications were flooded with links, tags, messages. Someone had sent me a headline, then someone else, then dozens more. I tapped one. "Parents skip daughter's wedding for store opening photos from Amalfi ceremony. Go viral." I blinked, staring at the first image. Me in my wedding dress standing at the cliff's edge as the sun hit the water. Lydia had captured the moment so cleanly it looked staged, though it wasn't. Another photo appeared beneath it. Ryan slipping the ring on my finger. Eleanor standing behind us, smiling. Then a harsh contrast. The editor had placed 2 images side by side. On the left, my sister Victoria, in a bold red gown at her Hollywood store launch, surrounded by cameras and neon lights. On the right, me in white lace, barefoot on stone, the sea crashing behind me. The caption read, "2 daughters, 2 worlds, 1 family decision." More articles appeared as I scrolled. Clark family chooses career over ceremony. Public outrage. After wedding snub. American architect marries without parents. Internet reacts. The world didn't need me to speak. It had already formed its opinion. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at the pictures, feeling a strange pressure in my chest. Not pain, not anger, something quieter, cooler. The world was telling the truth I had never bothered to explain. "I didn't expect this," Ryan said softly. Lydia's peace must have spread faster than she thought. I nodded, still scrolling. She didn't do this to be cruel. She did it because she sees things clearly. My phone buzzed again. This time with messages from colleagues, from acquaintances in Rome, even from people I barely remembered meeting at conferences, all saying some variation of "I saw the article. I had no idea. I hope you're okay." But I was okay. More okay than I'd been in years. I clicked on a video link that had been forwarded a dozen times. It was a segment from a morning show in Los Angeles. The host sat at a glossy white desk, shaking her head sympathetically. "It's one thing to miss a milestone," she said, "but to skip your daughter's wedding for a store opening. The internet is calling this a new level of cold." The camera then cut to footage of the store launch. The red carpet, the champagne tower, the posters of Victoria's face, and then, without warning, flashed to the photo of me standing on the cliff with Ryan. "That's heartbreaking," one of the panelists murmured. And honestly, that's karma. Hearing that word, karma, felt like a door clicking shut behind me. Not with vengeance, but with clarity. Ryan reached across the table and touched my hand. "Do you want to turn it off?" "No," I said. "Let it play." Meanwhile, across the ocean in Los Angeles, the scene was unfolding differently. The TV footage shifted to a shaky cell phone video someone had captured at the VC studio launch. Victoria was standing near the stage, holding a microphone, thanking sponsors. Behind her, a giant LED screen replayed images from the launch, effortlessly glamorous, until it abruptly glitched. For a split second, the wedding photo appeared. Me and Ryan, hands intertwined beneath the Amalfi Arch. Someone gasped in the crowd. Then the feed snapped back to Victoria's promotional footage, but the damage was done. People murmured. Cameras pivoted. Reporters exchanged looks. The contrast was too sharp, too cruel. Back in the studio, the co-host of the morning show raised a brow. "Awkward," she said. And in the Clark family living room, that same moment hit like a dropped glass. Victoria, according to what the article described, was flipping through channels when the story appeared on TV. The camera zoomed in on the split screen. Her radiant in red. Me serene in white. She froze. Her face crumpled. I didn't know she whispered. I didn't mean... Her words broke off. Richard, sitting beside her, grimaced and threw the remote across the room. It hit the wall with a sharp crack. "Who gave them those pictures?" he barked. Margaret didn't look away from the screen. Her voice was quiet, almost trembling. She didn't have to give anyone anything, she said. She didn't speak a word. But look, everyone's speaking for her now. Victoria covered her eyes. "Dad, I didn't try to hurt her. I really didn't. But guilt has a way of settling in whether you intend it or not." Back on the terrace in Amalfi, I watched the tide roll toward shore, slow and sure, as if it knew exactly where it needed to go. Ryan leaned back in his chair, studying my expression. "How are you feeling?" I let the phone rest on the table, like the world just said something I was never brave enough to say myself. He nodded. "And how does that feel?" I let out a small breath, then a smile. "Liberating." The sea breeze picked up, rustling the olive branches above us. I looked out across the shimmering water and let the moment settle. The world wasn't taking sides. It was simply telling the truth, and I didn't need to add a single word. The morning eventually stretched into afternoon, but the headlines kept coming louder and sharper. Clips played on Italian news stations. Hashtag Clark wedding snub trended across social media. Strangers online debated my family dynamics with more accuracy than anyone back home ever had. By evening, it felt like the whole world was staring directly at a fracture that had existed in my family for decades. But instead of feeling exposed, I felt seen. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the calm, beneath the quiet, something clicked in place like the final piece of a long, aching puzzle. They never expected the world to notice the daughter they ignored, but the world did. And it didn't whisper, it roared. The news didn't explode all at once. It came in waves, each one louder than the last. By the third week after the wedding, my inbox feeds and news apps had taken on a rhythm of their own. Every morning while the sun stretched across the cliffs and the villa warmed under the Italian sky, another headline from the USA made its way across the ocean: Clark Retail. Under scrutiny after viral wedding controversy, IRS. Reviewing financial statements of Clark Holdings. VC Studio suspends influencer partnerships. Amid public backlash, I skimmed them without absorbing too much. I didn't need to. The tone was always the same. Shock, speculation, disbelief that a family so obsessed with perfection had let its cracks show. One morning, I sat at the long kitchen island of the villa sipping espresso, while Ryan chopped fruit for breakfast. When the next notification buzzed, I didn't reach for it. But the headline flashed anyway on my screen, bright enough for both of us to see. Vice loses 3 major endorsements. After viral split-screen image brand may halt. Spring collection Ryan set the knife down gently. This is getting heavy, he said. It was always heavy, I replied. People are just noticing now. He studied me for a quiet moment. You don't seem upset. I'm not, I said, and strangely it was true. The consequences weren't mine to manage. They belonged to the people who had shaped the narrative, and were now being shaped by it. By noon, another email arrived. This one wasn't a headline. It was a name I didn't expect. From Thomas Grant. Subject: urgent request. Clark family. I opened it, scanning the paragraphs. He kept a formal tone, but the desperation leaked through. Madison. Given the recent media firestorm and its impact on the Clark family businesses, we strongly advise issuing a public statement. A brief comment could help de-escalate the situation and redirect attention away from your father and sister. Please consider. Thomas Grant, Counsel for Clark Holdings. I stared at the message for a long moment. Ryan leaned against the counter, watching my face. What are you thinking? He asked. That they're finally feeling what I've felt for years. And what do you want to do? Nothing. I typed a single sentence back. I don't need to say anything. They created this noise themselves. Then I hit send. A breeze came through the open balcony door, lifting the edge of the linen curtain. The villa smelled like sea salt and orange blossoms, completely untouched by the chaos churning 9,000 miles away. For the first time, I felt the difference between noise and truth. One fades, the other stays. That afternoon, Eleanor arrived wearing oversized sunglasses and a grin that told me she was carrying news she had been dying to share. Come with me, she said, waving her hand. We're going to be late. Late for what I asked. You'll see. She led us down the steps toward the path that curved around the villa and connected to the main road. A sleek black car waited there, engine humming. When we climbed in, the driver nodded respectfully and pulled away toward Positano's town hall. Inside the council chamber, the mayor, Lucia Romano, stood beside a table draped in deep blue fabric. On it sat a stack of documents, a ceremonial pen, and a small model of the eco-resort. The model I had spent months perfecting. Lucia smiled. We are ready to sign Madison. My heart skipped. Eleanor stepped closer, squeezing my hand. Ryan rested his palm on my back, steady and grounding. Photographers gathered as we moved through the ceremony. The mayor delivered a speech in Italian, elegant and sincere, praising the vision of the resort. Something sustainable, restorative, rooted in the landscape, rather than imposed on it. Then she asked me to step forward. As I leaned over the document and signed my name, cameras flashed. I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in a polished frame on the wall. Calm, composed, present. Not hiding. Not shrinking. A legacy built, not inherited. After the signing, a journalist approached me with a microphone. Madison, how does it feel knowing your work will reshape the Amalfi coastline? I smiled. It feels like the beginning of something that matters. We stood beside the architectural model for photos, Eleanor on one side, Ryan on the other. I looked at the curves of the resort, the terraces shaped to mirror the cliffs, the open-air pathways designed to catch sunlight from dawn to dusk. This was mine, not gifted, not overshadowed, not denied. Later, back at the villa, I opened my laptop to check the day's news. Another habit, though, one losing its sting. More stories about the Clark family fallout. Financial analysts speculating whether the IRS inquiry would expand. Photos of Victoria leaving a meeting with her PR team, head bowed. I didn't click any of them. Instead, I closed the laptop gently, letting the soft click blend into the sounds of evening. The sea, the distant chatter of tourists on the path, Eleanor humming in the kitchen. I walked out onto the balcony. The sun had just dipped behind the hills, leaving a blush of peach and lavender across the sky. The sea darkened to a quiet shade of blue. Karma doesn't come when you ask for it. It comes when someone needs to learn what you already know. I rested my hands on the cool stone railing and let the last light wash over me. They had lost their reputation. I had found my inheritance. The waves rolled in steady and certain, as if echoing the truth I finally felt in my bones. The sky had already shifted into its late afternoon colors when I arrived at Eleanor's studio. Those muted rose and honey tones that make Rome feel like it's exhaling after a long day. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, expecting to find her bent over a drafting table or rearranging the shelves the way she always did when she needed to think. Instead, I found her kneeling on the floor in front of an old cedar trunk, papers scattered around her like feathers. She didn't look up at first. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, as if she were touching something fragile. "What are you doing?" I asked softly. She startled a little, then smiled over her shoulder, trying to tame 30 years of my own mess. I stepped closer. In the trunk were rolls of blueprints, faded Polaroids. A couple of leather-bound sketchbooks that looked as though they hadn't been opened in decades. And then there was the envelope, yellowed with time edges softened by years of being tucked away. It lay on top of everything else, as if it had announced itself. To Eleanor, from Richard, the front read in handwriting I recognized instantly, my father's, the date beneath it 1994. My breath caught. Eleanor lifted the envelope, gently holding it like something burning just enough to warm her palms. "I found it buried between old contracts," she said. Her voice was quieter than usual, lined with something I couldn't name. "I didn't know it was here. Did you open it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I did." I sat across from her on the floor. The studio was silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside, and the sound of the envelope rustling as she placed it in my hands. "You should read it," she said. The paper inside was thin, nearly translucent. The ink slightly faded, but still perfectly legible. My father had always written with precision, every letter deliberate, every word measured. Even now, decades later, it looked like he'd written it yesterday. I unfolded it. "Eleanor, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to write this somewhere, even if I never send it. You've always done what I never had the courage to do. You lived by your own compass. If one day my daughter grows up and chooses silence the way you did, I hope I'm brave enough to hear what she's not saying. Maybe then I'll understand what I failed to see in you." Richard. My hands trembled. For a long moment I couldn't speak. The air in the studio thickened around me, pressing against my ribs. A strange ache bloomed in my chest. Not grief exactly, not anger, but something softer, heavier. "It was written when you were 7, Eleanor said, "before the distance between us became permanent." I kept staring at the paper. My father's words felt like echoes from a version of him I had never known. A man who recognized the hurt he caused, but couldn't bring himself to fix it. A man who saw the truth too late. "Why didn't he send it?" I whispered. "Pride," she said simply. "Or fear." I folded the letter back along its worn creases and held it in my lap. Something inside me felt like it was shifting slowly, quietly, like tectonic plates, finally acknowledging an old fracture. The truth didn't undo anything, but it illuminated everything. We sat there for several minutes, me on the cool tile. Eleanor with her back against the cedar trunk, the late sunlight slipping across her face. I realized her eyes looked tired, not from age, but from carrying years of unspoken history. "Come home with me tonight," I said gently. She nodded without hesitation. Back at the villa, Ryan was on the terrace, reading through structural reports. When he saw our expressions, he closed the folder immediately. "What happened?" he asked. I held up the envelope. "Something from my father." He didn't press. He just placed a hand on my shoulder as I walked past him into the living room. I set the letter on the table, smoothing it out beneath my fingertips. The villa filled with the sound of the waves below, the warm scent of the wooden beams, the quiet hum of the evening settling around us. Silence doesn't always hurt. Sometimes it reveals. I retrieved a small glass frame I'd bought months earlier for a wedding photo, one I hadn't gotten around to printing yet. Gently, I slid the letter inside. The delicate paper looked almost luminous under the glass. Then I placed it on the shelf beside a picture of Ryan and me taken on the morning of our ceremony. The two images didn't belong together, not in any traditional sense, but somehow, side by side, they told a fuller truth. Eleanor approached, her footsteps soft. "You don't have to keep that," she said, though her voice carried more hope than warning. "I want to," I replied. "It's not an apology, but it's recognition. Sometimes remorse doesn't show up wearing the right words." Sometimes it shows up as a sentence buried in a drawer for 30 years waiting to be found when you're finally strong enough to understand it. She placed her hand on my shoulder. You won, Madison. But don't let your victory make you hard. Win with kindness. Win with clarity. I turned to her, my throat tightening. I know, and I learned that from you. For the first time in my life, I leaned forward and embraced her. Not the polite kind, not the careful kind, but the kind that comes from knowing where your true home has always been. She rested her chin lightly on my head. Good girl, she whispered. Outside, the church bells began to ring. The sound drifted across the coastline, weaving into the steady crash of the sea. Late sunlight streamed through the window, washing the villa in gold. Soft, forgiving whole, I stood there holding on to her, feeling the letter's quiet truth settle into me like a tide easing against the shore. Night would fall soon, but the room still glowed. The studio glowed with warm light, the kind that makes every polished surface look softer. Lived in, touched by something human. It was early summer of 2025, and Clark Studio Europe, my studio, was alive with the sound of laughter glasses clinking and Italian jazz humming from a small speaker by the window. A year ago, the Amalfi Eco Resort project had been nothing more than renderings taped to my office wall. Now it had broken ground, gained international attention, and become the kind of work I used to only daydream about on long nights in Berkeley. Tonight was a celebration of all of it. Ryan stood near the open terrace doors talking with two of our engineers. He looked relaxed, tan, from months of construction oversight, his sleeves rolled up, eyes bright, every time he glanced in my direction. Eleanor moved gracefully through the room, greeting guests with her calm, knowing smile. Lydia held a glass of white wine in one hand, and her camera in the other, capturing the small, intimate moments, instead of the posed ones. I stood near the terrace railing, watching the last slices of pink dissolve into the sea. 1 year. Only 1 year since everything broke open. And yet it felt like a lifetime. People drifted toward me offering congratulations, praise, questions about next phases of the project. I answered them all, smiling, grateful, grounded. But a thread of stillness wove itself through me. The kind of quiet that settles when the noise of old wounds no longer echoes the way it once did. At some point during the evening, my phone buzzed inside my pocket. I thought about ignoring it, but habit pulled it out anyway. One unread message. From Mom. Your father isn't well. He wants to see you. Mom. Just those 2 sentences. The words didn't shock me. They didn't hurt. They didn't soothe. They just landed, light as paper, heavy as history. I stared at the message, feeling the faint stir of something. Sadness, maybe. Or simply the acknowledgement that time always runs ahead of us, whether we heal or not. Ryan approached quietly, noticing my expression. Everything okay? I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. Yeah, just a message. From them, I nodded. He didn't ask more. Instead, he touched my arm lightly, a gesture that said I'm here without demanding anything more from me. Across the room, Lydia waved me over for a photo. I excused myself, slipping into the soft light of the terrace, where she lifted her camera. Hold still, she said. You're glowing in that my life fell apart and came back better way. I laughed. Is that an actual category? Only for my favorite cases? She smirked, snapping the shot. Then her expression shifted into something more sincere. You know, you've built something really rare here. Not just the project, the life, the peace. It sat warm inside my chest. Eleanor joined us moments later, holding another bottle of wine. To Maddie, she said, raising it toward me. To the woman who proved reinvention isn't a phase, it's a calling. Everyone nearby cheered softly. Later in the night, when most guests had drifted out and the studio had quieted into a pleasant hum, I stepped into my office and sank onto the small sofa by the window. The villa lights twinkled across the cliffs. The sea stretched wide and dark, and the moon painted the water in silver strokes. A year ago, the silence in moments like this felt lonely. Now it felt earned. I reached for the remote and flicked on the small TV mounted on the wall, mostly for background noise while I closed out a few emails. A documentary on Italian architecture played for a few minutes before cutting to a commercial break. Then a familiar program came on, the American business segment that often covered international design. I considered changing the channel, but something held me still. The anchor spoke in her smooth broadcast tone. In tonight's spotlight, Clark Studio Europe continues to draw global attention as their Amalfi eco-resort moves into its second phase. Footage of the construction site appeared, workers laying stone sunlight spilling across terraces, my sketches pinned to makeshift boards. Then a photo of me speaking at the groundbreaking. I leaned forward slightly. The camera cut again, this time to a living room I recognized even under dim light. My parents. Richard sat in his favorite leather chair shoulders, not as straight as I remembered. Margaret sat beside him on the sofa. Her hands folded, her expression soft. They watched the screen silently. Then my father said, almost to himself, "She looks happy." For the first time in years, his voice didn't carry judgment or disappointment, just observation, maybe awe. Margaret nodded, her voice quiet but sure. "I think this is the first time she truly is." The program continued, but I didn't listen anymore. My father, the man whose approval I had chased for decades, was seeing me clearly for the first time through a screen that showed the life I built without him. My phone buzzed again on the cushion beside me, but I didn't check it. I didn't have to. Whatever message waited wasn't urgent. Not anymore. The documentary ended. A scrolling news update moved across the bottom of the screen. Victoria Clark opens small handmade goods studio in Portland. Steps away from Vise. I smiled, unexpected but genuine. We had all splintered from the original story, the one written for us long before any of us had the courage to challenge it. And yet here we were, each finding a version of life that fit. Everyone finds their own path. Some choose applause, some choose peace. Mine had finally stopped choosing for me, and for the first time I felt ready to let the silence speak for itself. The evening had settled into that tender golden hour when everything, stone, sea, sky, seemed to soften at the edges. I stepped outside the villa and followed the narrow path down toward the rocky shoreline, the air warm enough to carry the scent of salt and rosemary. The horizon burned a gentle orange, fading into rose, and then into blue, so deep it felt like you could fall into it. I walked slowly, letting the pebbles shift beneath my sandals, listening to the rhythm of the water slipping in and out between the rocks. The waves were small tonight, almost shy, lapping against the shore with the softness of breath. A year ago, I would have been replaying old conversations in my mind, cataloging every hurt, every dismissal, every moment where I felt unseen. But now, the only thing echoing inside me was quiet. A clean, unburdened kind of quiet. I reached the low stone railing that curved along the cliff's edge and rested my hands on it. The stone was warm from the day's heat. I leaned forward slightly, watching the sun dip closer to the water. The light hit my wedding band and sent a small shimmer across the stone, subtle, steady, real. Behind me, I heard soft laughter. I didn't turn right away, but I knew the sound. Eleanor's low, amused hum, Ryan's warm reply. They stood together near the steps, talking in that easy way they did when the world around us felt certain and good. For so long, I thought justice meant hearing someone say I was wrong. I thought closure was something handed to you, an apology, an explanation, a confession. But standing there watching the colors shift above the Mediterranean, I understood something I hadn't been ready to understand before. Justice is peace without permission. I closed my eyes and inhaled slowly. The air tasted like salt and sun-warmed stone. When I exhaled, something inside me loosened that I didn't even know I was still holding. I had spent years wishing my parents would see me, years trying to prove I mattered. And yet here, surrounded by choices I made for myself, I realized I no longer needed them to. They could keep their silence. I had found mine. The sound of a piano drifted faintly across the courtyard. Someone inside the villa must have brushed against the keys, letting a handful of notes spill into the evening air. It was soft, almost accidental, but it moved through me like memory. When I turned around, the villa glowed from within. Warm and amber light spilled out through the tall, arched windows, catching dust motes that swirled lazily in the air. Through the glass, I saw the life I'd built piece by piece, the sketches pinned to the wall, the books stacked on the table. the photographs of the resort project, mid-construction. The space didn't just hold my work, it held my becoming. Eleanor noticed me turning and lifted her hand in a small wave. Ryan stepped beside her, slipping his arm loosely around her shoulders in a gesture somewhere between affection and gratitude. He adored her almost as much as I did. I walked back toward them, the stones warm beneath my feet. "You wandered off," Ryan said with a soft smile. "I needed a minute." "Find what you were looking for?" Eleanor asked. I glanced back at the sea, now settling into deeper shades of blue, the last streak of sunlight melting into the horizon. My chest felt open, steady, unbruised. "Yes," I said, "I did." We headed toward the villa together, climbing the steps slowly. The wind picked up just enough to carry the last whisper of piano notes toward us. When we reached the doorway, I paused and looked over my shoulder one last time. The sea below was perfectly still, a mirror of everything I finally felt inside, unshaken, undisturbed. They couldn't say a word, and the sea didn't need to, neither did I. I stepped inside, letting the warm light wrap around me, and closed the door gently behind us. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, if someone has ever made you feel small, remember this. Peace is louder than anger. Silence is sharper than any confrontation. And the life you build for yourself is the clearest answer you will ever give. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell me what part struck you the most. Your voice matters here, and I'd love to hear it.